In the quaint town of Brooksville, nestled in the heart of the American Midwest, life meandered along familiar paths. The town's charm lay in its cobblestone streets, historic architecture, and a close-knit community that prided itself on neighborly values. Yet, beneath this picturesque facade, undercurrents of prejudice and unspoken biases lingered. On a crisp autumn morning, as leaves painted the streets in hues of amber and gold, a new resident made his presence known. Marcus Green, a distinguished African-American professor of history, had recently relocated to Brooksville to embrace a quieter life away from the bustling city. His arrival was met with polite curiosity by some and silent apprehension by others. Among the latter was Eleanor Whitaker, a woman in her late 50s, whose family had lived in Brooksville for generations. Eleanor's world was one of tradition and routine, her perceptions shaped by a lifetime in a homogeneous community. The sight of Marcus moving into the old Victorian house next door unsettled her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. One evening, as dusk settled and shadows lengthened, Marcus decided to take a stroll through his new neighborhood. Clad in a tailored overcoat, he walked with a thoughtful demeanor, absorbing the serenity that Brooksville offered. As he passed Eleanor's house, she peered through her lace-curtained window, her mind racing with unfounded suspicions. Convinced that Marcus's presence was out of place, Eleanor reached for her phone and dialed 911. Her voice, tinged with fear and prejudice, conveyed a fabricated narrative of a suspicious man loitering in the neighborhood. Within minutes, the wail of sirens disrupted the evening calm, and police cars converged on the scene. The officers approached Marcus with caution, their hands hovering near their holsters. Confusion and concern etched across his face. Marcus complied with their commands, providing identification and explaining his recent move to Brooksville. The tension was palpable, a stark contrast to the peaceful walk he had envisioned. After verifying his story and realizing the baselessness of the call, the officers offered terse apologies and departed, leaving Marcus standing alone under the dim glow of a street lamp. The incident left an indelible mark on him, a poignant reminder that prejudice could infiltrate even the most idyllic settings. Eleanor, watching from her window, felt a fleeting pang of guilt as she observed the scene unfold. Yet, her ingrained biases quickly quelled any remorse, and she retreated into the comfort of her familiar prejudices. Unbeknownst to her, the consequences of her actions would soon ripple through the fabric of Brooksville, challenging the very notions of community and humanity. As the night deepened, Marcus sat by his window, gazing at the stars obscured by the town's lights. He pondered the challenges that lay ahead, resolved to confront the ignorance that had cast a shadow over his welcome. Little did he know, this incident was merely the prologue to a series of events that would test the resilience of his spirit and the conscience of a town clinging to outdated ideals. The following morning, Brooksville was alive with its usual rhythms, the sound of children heading to school, shopkeepers opening their doors, and the faint hum of cars cruising down the cobbled streets. But for Marcus Green, the air felt heavier, laden with the weight of the previous night's encounter. Sitting at his kitchen table, he nursed a cup of coffee, replaying the incident in his mind. The officers' stern voices, the way their eyes measured him with suspicion, and the sight of Eleanor Whitaker peeking through her curtains like a hidden puppet master. It all lingered like a bitter aftertaste. Marcus had spent his life dealing with moments like these, microaggressions and overt prejudices alike. But he had hoped, maybe naively, that his new start in Brooksville would be different. That hope had lasted all of 2 days. Later that afternoon, Marcus decided he wouldn't let the incident fester. He was a man of action, a scholar who believed in bridging divides through conversation. Gathering a small basket of freshly baked muffins he had purchased earlier from the local bakery, he made his way next door to Eleanor Whitaker's house. Eleanor, in her typical morning routine, sat on her front porch in a wicker chair, a glass of iced tea sweating on the small table beside her. She squinted as Marcus approached, her expression tightening like a clenched fist. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker," Marcus began politely, offering a smile. "I wanted to introduce myself properly. My name is Marcus Green, your new neighbor." Eleanor's eyes darted to the basket in his hand, then back to his face. "I know who you are," she said curtly, her tone colder than the autumn breeze. Marcus remained calm, undeterred. "I brought some muffins from the local bakery. Just a small gesture." "I don't need muffins," Eleanor snapped, folding her arms across her chest. "And I don't need introductions." There was silence for a moment. Marcus studied the lines on her face, the deep creases of a lifetime spent holding on to something. Fear, anger, perhaps both. He could sense her discomfort, the way she kept herself braced like a soldier behind enemy lines. "I'm sorry if I caused you any concern last night," Marcus said softly. "I was just taking a walk. I didn't mean to alarm anyone." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "You shouldn't have been out so late. This is a quiet town." "I understand," Marcus replied gently. "But I belong here as much as anyone else. I'm not going anywhere." The words hung in the air, unyielding yet calm. Eleanor blinked, perhaps surprised by his steadiness. Marcus placed the basket on the edge of her porch railing and turned to leave. "Have a good day, Mrs. Whitaker," he said over his shoulder. As he walked back to his house, he could feel her eyes boring into his back. Marcus wasn't certain if he had planted any seeds of change in Eleanor's mind, but he was sure of one thing: he would not let her ignorance drive him away. By the end of the week, news of the incident had begun to spread. Small towns like Brooksville were fueled by whispers, and it didn't take long for Marcus's encounter with the police to become the talk of the town. Some expressed quiet shame. Others dismissed it as an unfortunate misunderstanding. But a few, including Eleanor's closest friends, found themselves emboldened by her actions. "It's about time someone looked out for this neighborhood," Eleanor told her friend Dorothy one afternoon as they sipped coffee at the local diner. "We don't need strangers stirring things up." Dorothy, a woman equally set in her ways, nodded in agreement. "I'm sure he's harmless, but you never know." But not everyone shared their views. Down at the Brooksville Public Library, where Marcus had recently begun volunteering, librarian Clara Hensley, an older woman with a kind face and sharp mind, heard the gossip and decided to meet Marcus for herself. Clara knocked on Marcus's door one afternoon with a plate of cookies and an apology. "I heard what happened the other night," she said when he opened the door. "And I'm sorry, Marcus. You don't deserve that kind of welcome." Marcus was touched by the gesture. He invited Clara in, and they sat at his kitchen table, sharing cookies and conversation. She asked him about his work, his decision to move to Brooksville, and his life story. "I taught history for 20 years, Marcus explained. "I've always been passionate about understanding the past to make sense of the present. It's one of the reasons I moved here. I wanted to write a book, something reflective, something that challenges how we see our communities." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "Brooksville could use that kind of challenge. People here, they don't always see beyond their own experiences." "Change is hard," Marcus agreed. "But I believe it's possible." Clara smiled. "You've got a good heart, Marcus. Don't let this town harden it." That night, Eleanor sat alone in her house, turning the radio dial absent-mindedly as static crackled between stations. Her mind wandered back to her interaction with Marcus, the calmness in his voice, the way he had refused to meet her anger with anger. It unsettled her. Something about him reminded her of a moment long buried in her past, a memory she didn't want to revisit. She pushed it away, as she always did, and convinced herself that her actions were justified. But deep down, The first cracks in her resolve had begun to form, and Marcus, though unaware of it, had already started to change the heart of Brooksville, one small act at a time. Marcus settled into his new life in Brooksville with quiet determination. He spent his days volunteering at the public library, where he struck up a warm friendship with Clara Hensley, and his evenings working on his book. The incident with Eleanor Whitaker lingered in his mind, but he had long learned that bitterness was a burden he refused to carry. Instead, he turned his energy to integrating himself into the community and letting his actions speak louder than the whispers that followed him. Meanwhile, Eleanor's unease festered. Each day she watched Marcus come and go, his calm demeanor gnawing at her like an itch she couldn't scratch. At first, she'd convinced herself that calling the police had been the right decision. "A good neighbor is a vigilant neighbor," she repeated to Dorothy and the others who shared her morning coffee at the diner. But the town had begun to shift, subtly at first. When Marcus hosted a free community history workshop at the library, Brooksville Through the Ages, dozens of people showed up. He spoke with passion about the roots of the town, connecting its story to the broader history of the Midwest and America. People were impressed. Parents brought their children to listen. Even some of Eleanor's neighbors attended and returned with glowing praise. "Did you know his family has a long line of educators?" Clara told Dorothy at the diner one morning, in earshot of Eleanor. "And he's traveled all over the country teaching history. He's quite brilliant." Dorothy nodded politely, though she glanced at Eleanor for her reaction. Eleanor's face remained impassive, but inwardly she bristled. Why were people suddenly so quick to embrace him? 2 weeks later, an unexpected event pushed the fragile status quo even further. One chilly Saturday afternoon, Brooksville held its annual Autumn Fest, a beloved tradition featuring food stalls, live music, and games for families. The festival brought the entire town together, and Marcus, always eager to engage with his new neighbors, volunteered to help run a booth featuring historical trivia about Brooksville. As Marcus entertained a group of curious kids with stories of Brooksville's founding, Eleanor arrived at the festival. Dressed in her finest coat and scarf, she scanned the crowd, quietly observing. Her attention was drawn to Marcus's booth, where she noticed how easily he captivated the children. "You're saying Brooksville was founded near an old trading post?" one boy asked, wide-eyed. "That's right," Marcus replied, kneeling to the boy's level. "This town has always been a place where different people came together. If you dig into history, you'll find that we're all more connected than we think." The boy grinned and nodded. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "He too?" Eleanor couldn't help herself. She approached the booth, clearing her throat to announce her presence. Marcus stood up, offering his usual warm smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitaker. Enjoying the festival?" he asked. Eleanor ignored the pleasantries. "You seem to know a lot about this town's history," she said coolly, "but you're not from here. Isn't it a bit bold to start lecturing people about it?" The crowd around the booth quieted, sensing the sudden tension. Marcus held her gaze, calm as ever. "History belongs to all of us, Mrs. Whitaker," he replied gently. "And I think it's important that we share it, especially with the next generation. Wouldn't you agree?" Eleanor's mouth opened slightly, as if to retort, but no words came. For a moment, there was silence. Then Clara Hensley stepped forward from the crowd. "He's doing a good thing here, Eleanor," Clara said firmly. "Maybe it's time we listen to more people like Marcus." There were murmurs of agreement. Eleanor felt the eyes of the crowd on her, and a flush of heat rose to her cheeks. Without another word, she turned and walked briskly away, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her living room, the faint hum of the clock the only sound. The day's events replayed in her mind. Marcus's words, Clara's challenge, the murmurs of support from the crowd. She was unused to being questioned, to feeling out of step with the very community she had always considered hers. Her thoughts turned to Marcus. Why couldn't he just stay quiet, stay invisible? And why, despite her resentment, did his words keep echoing in her mind? History belongs to all of us. For the first time in years, Eleanor found herself staring at an old photograph hanging on her wall. It was her father, a stern man in a stiff suit, standing with a young boy, a black boy in the background. She'd always ignored that boy's presence in the photo, pretending it wasn't worth remembering. But tonight, she couldn't look away. The next morning, Marcus awoke to a sound he hadn't expected, a knock at his door. When he opened it, there stood Eleanor Whitaker, clutching a pie dish in her gloved hands. "Good morning," Marcus said, surprised. Eleanor hesitated. "I made this for you," she said finally, holding out the dish. "Apple pie." Marcus took it, studying her carefully. Her face was unreadable, but something had shifted in her eyes, a softness that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," Marcus said sincerely. "Would you like to come in?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not today," she replied. Then, after a pause, she added, "I might stop by the library sometime to hear more of what you have to say about history." Marcus smiled, understanding what those words meant. "I'd be honored, Mrs. Whitaker." Eleanor gave a small nod and turned to leave, her steps slower than usual. As Marcus closed the door, he placed the pie on the kitchen table and sat down, staring at it for a long moment. It was a small gesture, but sometimes change began with the smallest of things: a knock at the door, a pie dish, a willingness to listen. The arrival of Eleanor Whitaker at Marcus's door with an apple pie was like the first drop of rain before a storm. Small, quiet, but impossible to ignore. It rippled through Marcus's mind long after she had left, leaving him to wonder what had softened her resolve. Though Eleanor's pride still clung to her like a veil, Marcus sensed something deeper beneath the surface. Conflict, maybe even regret. For the next few days, Eleanor stayed true to her word. She didn't knock again, nor did she offer friendly waves, but there were glimpses of change. She began walking past Marcus's house on her daily strolls, her pace slowing slightly, her eyes lingering on his porch. She would quickly look away if she caught sight of him, but Marcus saw her nonetheless. Meanwhile, Brooksville continued to shift. Clara Hensley's quiet championing of Marcus had found its way into more conversations. Parents praised Marcus's workshops, and even skeptics admitted that the professor had a gentle way about him. His demeanor began disarming people in ways that gossip never could. The breakthrough came on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. Marcus was deep into his work at the library, sorting through a stack of books for his upcoming lecture, when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "You said history belongs to all of us. Does that mean you'll answer my questions?" Marcus turned to see Eleanor Whitaker standing there, hands clasped over her purse, her expression carefully neutral. Clara, who had been shelving books nearby, paused mid-motion and exchanged a quick glance with Marcus. "Of course, Mrs. Whitaker," Marcus replied warmly. "Have a seat." Eleanor lowered herself into a chair across from him. "I don't have much time," she said, as if to defend her presence. "But I've been thinking about something you said at the Autumn Fest. You talked about this town's history, about how it connects people." "I did." "Well," Eleanor continued, clearing her throat, "what happens when parts of that history are uncomfortable?" Marcus met her gaze, understanding the weight of her words. "We face it," he said gently, "because ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. If we're brave enough to confront the truth, we can begin to understand not just where we come from, but where we can go." Eleanor's expression tightened. "That sounds easier than it is." "It's never easy," Marcus agreed, "but it's worth it." For a moment the two sat in silence. Then Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph, old, sepia-toned, worn at the edges, She placed it on the table between them. "That's my father," she said, pointing to the tall man at the center of the image. "This was taken in 1954. And that boy in the background, he worked for us. His name was Henry." Marcus leaned forward, studying the photograph carefully. The boy, likely no older than 12 or 13, stood near the edge of the frame, half out of focus. "I've spent my whole life pretending that boy didn't matter," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father, he wasn't kind to him, and I wasn't either." Marcus looked up, his gaze steady. "You were a child," he said softly. Eleanor shook her head. "Children know what kindness is, and they know what it isn't. I knew, I just didn't do anything. That boy left one day, and I never saw him again. I don't even know what happened to him." The confession hung between them like an open wound. Marcus could hear the regret in her voice, the burden of years spent burying a truth she was now ready to confront. "You're asking about uncomfortable history, Mrs. Whitaker," Marcus said gently. "This is yours." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with a sadness she'd held back for decades. "Do you think people can change?" "I know they can," Marcus replied, "because change doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. What matters now is what you do with what you've learned." Eleanor nodded slowly, taking the photograph back and slipping it into her purse. "I don't know where to start," she admitted. "You already have," Marcus said. Eleanor left the library in silence that day, her mind swirling with memories she'd tried to suppress for so long. As she walked home, she felt the familiar pangs of guilt, but also something unexpected, a sense of lightness, as though speaking the truth had released her from the chains of her past. That evening, Eleanor sat by her window, staring out at the street as the day faded to dusk. For the first time in years, she thought of Henry, not as a nameless shadow in the background of her memories, but as a boy who had once been part of her life. She wondered what had happened to him, where he'd gone, and whether he had found peace. And then her gaze shifted to Marcus's house next door. She saw him through the window, sitting at his desk, writing. In that moment, Eleanor made a decision. The next morning, Marcus found a small envelope slipped beneath his front door. Inside was a handwritten note. "Professor Green, I need your help. Eleanor Whitaker." Marcus turned the note over, but there was nothing more. A mixture of curiosity and hope flickered through him as he placed the envelope on his desk. Whatever this was, it marked a turning point. Eleanor Whitaker, the woman who had called the police on him just weeks earlier, was now asking for his help. Change had begun in Brooksville, and it was only the beginning. The note sat on Marcus's desk for a long while as he stared at it, processing the unexpected turn of events. Eleanor Whitaker, the woman who once regarded him with suspicion and contempt, was now asking for his help. He wondered what had stirred this change in her, what ghosts of her past were suddenly demanding to be heard. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his pocket before heading next door. The air was crisp that morning, the last traces of autumn hanging in the sky as Brooksville prepared itself for winter. Eleanor's house, with its well-kept garden and lace-curtained windows, still bore an air of stifling control, much like the woman herself. When Eleanor opened the door, she looked both hesitant and expectant. "I figured you'd come," she said softly, stepping aside to let Marcus in. Her living room was as Marcus imagined, tidy, meticulously decorated, and steeped in nostalgia. The scent of cinnamon tea hung in the air, and black and white photographs lined the mantel above the fireplace. Eleanor gestured to a seat, sitting across from Marcus in her usual rigid posture, though her hands fidgeted in her lap. "Thank you for coming," she began after a long pause. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," Marcus admitted, his tone kind but honest. "But I'm here. How can I help, Mrs. Whitaker?" Eleanor reached into a small drawer in the side table beside her and pulled out the photograph of her father and Henry, the same one she'd shown him in the library. She placed it on the coffee table between them, her fingers lingering over its edges as though touching it brought back memories. "I need to know what happened to him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Henry, that boy. I don't even know his last name." Marcus studied her for a moment, understanding the depth of what she was asking. Eleanor wasn't just looking for Henry. She was looking for redemption, for closure, for a chance to right, even slightly, a lifetime of guilt. "Do you know anything else about him?" Marcus asked. "Anything at all? Where his family might have lived? What he liked to do?" Eleanor's brow furrowed as she searched her memories. They lived on the edge of town, near the old mill. His father was a laborer, but they were poor. I remember Henry being quiet. He never looked adults in the eye. My father made sure of that. Her voice cracked slightly, but she composed herself. He liked to draw, though. He used to scratch pictures into the dirt with sticks when no one was watching. I remember thinking he was talented, but I never told him. Marcus nodded. "It's not a lot to go on, but it's something. I'll see what I can find." Eleanor looked up at him, her blue eyes clouded with both hope and fear. "Why are you helping me?" Marcus met her gaze steadily. "Because history matters, Mrs. Whitaker. Henry's story matters, and so does what you're trying to do now." Marcus threw himself into the search with the same determination that had carried him through decades of scholarship. He spent hours in the dusty archives of the Brooksville Library, poring over property records, census data, and old newspapers. With Clara's help, he tracked down fragments of information about families who had lived near the old mill in the 1950s. One evening, as he flipped through a fragile issue of the Brooksville Sentinel, Marcus's breath caught. There, buried in a small column, was a mention of a tragic accident at the mill from the summer of 1954. A man named Robert Jennings, a black laborer, had been killed in an equipment malfunction, leaving behind a wife and 2 children. Marcus traced his finger over the text, his mind racing. Could Robert Jennings have been Henry's father? The dates aligned, as did the location. He made a note of the name and continued digging. The days turned into a week, but Marcus's efforts finally bore fruit. He tracked down records of a family named Jennings who had left Brooksville shortly after the accident. Through more research, he found a lead. A man named Henry Jennings, now in his 70s, living in a small town 2 states over. Marcus sat back in his chair, exhaling deeply as the weight of the discovery settled over him. He stared at Henry's name on the screen, feeling a mixture of triumph and responsibility. The next step was clear. Eleanor sat in her living room, staring out the window when Marcus knocked on her door. She opened it quickly, her face betraying her nervous anticipation. "Did you find anything?" she asked breathlessly. Marcus nodded. "I did. His name is Henry Jennings. He's alive, Mrs. Whitaker. I found him." Eleanor staggered back slightly, as though the news had taken the air from her lungs. She sank onto the nearest chair, her hands trembling. "Where is he?" she whispered. "He lives in a small town a few hours away," Marcus said gently. "I have an address." Eleanor looked up at Marcus, tears welling in her eyes. "I need to see him," she said. "I need to tell him. I need him to know that I'm sorry." Marcus hesitated. "It's not that simple, Mrs. Whitaker. This isn't just about what you need. It's about what he needs too. If we do this, we have to be prepared for whatever his response might be." Eleanor wiped her eyes, straightening her back. "I don't care if he slams the door in my face. I just need to try." Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, we'll go together." The morning they set out, the sky was overcast and the road stretched endlessly ahead. Eleanor sat quietly in the passenger seat of Marcus's car, her hands folded in her lap. "What will you say to him?" Marcus asked after a while, breaking the silence. Eleanor stared out the window, her voice soft but resolute. "I don't know yet. I just want to tell him the truth. That I should have been better, that I'm sorry." Marcus nodded, sensing the sincerity in her words. As the miles passed, Eleanor thought of the boy she had ignored all those years ago, the boy who had carved drawings into the earth when no one was looking. And for the first time, she allowed herself to truly see him. Henry Jennings wasn't a nameless shadow anymore. He was a person. And now, she would face him. The drive stretched on in silence, the hum of the car engine a low and steady rhythm that filled the air between Marcus and Eleanor. Outside, the world rolled past in shades of gray, the clouds hanging heavy like unspoken words. Eleanor sat rigidly in the passenger seat, her face pale and distant. The truth she had carried for so many years was now a weight she could no longer bear alone. Marcus occasionally glanced over at her, reading the worry etched in the lines of her face. He knew this journey was as much about Eleanor confronting herself as it was about finding Henry Jennings. Redemption, after all, often demanded a confrontation with the darkest corners of one's soul. When they finally arrived in the small town, a quiet place surrounded by hills and trees just beginning to turn for winter, Eleanor exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Marcus parked the car outside a modest house on a narrow street. The home was unremarkable but tidy, a white-painted exterior with a porch swing creaking gently in the breeze. Eleanor stared at the house, clutching her purse tightly in her lap. "What if he doesn't want to see me?" she murmured, her voice small. "He might not," Marcus replied gently, "but you're here because you need to try. And whatever happens, you'll know you've done that." She nodded faintly and opened the car door. Marcus followed her up the short walkway, letting her take the lead. Eleanor's steps were slow and measured, her hand trembling as she knocked softly on the door. They waited. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind brushing against the trees. Then footsteps approached from within. The door opened. Standing there was Henry Jennings. Time had etched itself into his face, lines of age, experience, and resilience, but his eyes were sharp and alive, a deep brown that seemed to hold decades of unspoken stories. He was tall, lean, with gray hair cropped close to his scalp. He wore a comfortable cardigan over a plain shirt, and his expression was unreadable as his gaze shifted from Eleanor to Marcus and back again. Henry studied Eleanor for a moment before speaking, his voice steady but curious. "Can I help you?" Eleanor's lips parted, but for a moment, no sound came out. She seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of the moment, but then, with a visible effort, she straightened her back. "Mr. Jennings," she began softly, "my name is Eleanor Whitaker. I don't know if you remember me." Henry's brow furrowed as he searched her face, and then recognition flickered in his eyes like a spark. His jaw tightened slightly, and his posture shifted. "I remember you," he said. Eleanor swallowed hard. "I came here because I need to tell you something. Something I should have said a long time ago." Henry stood in the doorway, unmoving. His silence was unnerving, but Eleanor pressed on, her voice trembling. "I was a child when you worked for my father. I saw things I shouldn't have ignored. I said things I shouldn't have said, and I never did anything to make it better. I've carried that with me for years, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for the way I treated you, for the way my family treated you." Henry's expression didn't soften. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as if weighing her words. "You came all this way to tell me that?" he asked finally. "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "I couldn't let another day go by without saying it." Henry exhaled, looking past her for a moment, as though pulling his thoughts from somewhere deep within. He stepped out onto the porch, closing the door softly behind him. "Come sit," he said, gesturing toward the swing. Eleanor hesitated, her surprise evident, but she followed him. Marcus stood back, leaning quietly against the railing, understanding that this was Eleanor's moment. Henry sat on the swing, his hands resting on his knees, and Eleanor settled beside him, leaving a respectful space between them. "You know," Henry began, his voice low and calm, "I spent years trying to forget Brooksville. My father worked himself to the bone at that mill to give us a better life, and it still wasn't enough. After he died, my mother packed us up, and we left. I never looked back." Eleanor listened silently, her eyes fixed on her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. "I remembered you," Henry continued, his gaze distant. "A little girl with blonde curls and a sharp tongue. Your father didn't just work us, he broke us. And the worst part is, no one cared. No one thought we mattered." Eleanor's breath hitched, but she didn't interrupt. "I was angry for a long time," Henry admitted. "Angry at your father, angry at your whole town. But mostly I was angry at myself, for being too afraid to stand up, for feeling like I had no choice but to endure it." He turned to look at Eleanor then, his eyes sharp and piercing. "And now you're here, after all these years. Why?" Eleanor looked up, her voice trembling but steady. "Because I couldn't let my silence be the end of your story. I was wrong, Henry, and I can't change the past, but I can tell the truth now. And the truth is, you mattered. You always did." For the first time, Henry's gaze softened. He looked at her for what felt like an eternity, and then he nodded slowly, as though acknowledging a truth he had long kept buried. "Maybe I needed to hear that," he said quietly. Eleanor blinked, her tears finally breaking free. "Thank you," she whispered. Henry offered a small smile, one filled with both sadness and peace. "We can't change what happened," he said, "but we can choose what we do with it now." The two of them sat there in silence, as the swing swayed gently beneath them, the creak of the chains mingling with the whisper of the wind. Marcus watched from the porch railing, a sense of quiet awe settling over him. He had seen history, the living, breathing kind, come full circle. The wounds of the past would never fully heal, but the first steps had been taken. The truth had been spoken, and sometimes that was enough to begin again. As Marcus and Eleanor drove back to Brooksville later that day, the air between them felt lighter. Eleanor stared out the window, her eyes red but her face peaceful. "Thank you," she said softly. Marcus glanced at her. "For what?" "For helping me face it," she replied. "For helping me see what I needed to see." Marcus smiled faintly, returning his eyes to the road. "It's not over yet, Mrs. Whitaker. There's always more work to do." Eleanor nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in decades, she believed that change, real change, was possible. And back in that quiet town of Brooksville, a new story was beginning to unfold. The return to Brooksville was quiet. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, though it was clear her thoughts lingered elsewhere. Marcus glanced at her occasionally, observing the way her hands now rested calmly in her lap. There was something different about her, a lightness that hadn't been there before, a sign, perhaps, that speaking her truth to Henry had started to free her. When they pulled into her driveway, Eleanor hesitated before getting out. She turned to Marcus, her expression somber but sincere. "Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" she asked softly. Marcus considered the question. "I think forgiveness is his choice to make, not yours to demand. But I also think you gave him something important. A voice. Sometimes that's the first step." Eleanor nodded, absorbing his words. She opened the car door, pausing to look at Marcus one more time. "Thank you, Professor Green, for everything." "You're welcome, Mrs. Whitaker," he said gently. "And remember, change doesn't happen all at once. It happens one step at a time." With that, Eleanor stepped out of the car and disappeared into her house, leaving Marcus to sit alone for a moment, reflecting on everything that had brought them to this point. It had taken courage for Eleanor to face Henry Jennings, but the ripples of that moment, the truth finally spoken, were only just beginning. The following day, word of Eleanor's trip began to spread through Brooksville, carried by the same whispers that had once fueled gossip about Marcus himself. It started with Clara Hensley, who visited Marcus at the library that morning. "She really did it?" Clara asked, her voice filled with quiet amazement. "She did," Marcus replied with a small smile. "It wasn't easy, but she faced him." Clara shook her head, her admiration evident. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day Eleanor Whittaker admitted she was wrong about anything." "People surprise us sometimes," Marcus said thoughtfully. "It just takes the right push." Clara leaned on the counter, watching him closely. "You were that push, Marcus. Don't forget that." Marcus looked up, meeting her kind gaze. "Maybe," he replied, "but she had to take the steps herself." Clara nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "Well, it's a step this town needed too. You've done more for Brooksville than you realize." In the days that followed, Marcus noticed small shifts throughout town. At the library, more people began attending his workshops, including a few faces he'd seen avoiding him before. Conversations seemed more open, less guarded. Parents brought their children to the library to hear Marcus's lectures, eager for them to learn about Brooksville's complicated history, and to see the value of every voice in shaping that history. But perhaps the most surprising change came from Eleanor herself. One afternoon, Marcus spotted her standing in the town square, speaking with a group of women who often frequented the local diner. Dorothy, Eleanor's closest friend, stood beside her, clearly bewildered by the words coming out of Eleanor's mouth. "It's not about forgetting the past," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear. "It's about learning from it. I spent years pretending I didn't see what was right in front of me. I won't do that anymore." Dorothy shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances with the others. "Eleanor, are you saying we've all been wrong?" "I'm saying we've all been blind," Eleanor replied firmly. "But it's not too late to open our eyes." The women fell silent, processing Eleanor's words. Marcus, watching from a distance, felt a flicker of pride. Eleanor Whittaker, the woman who once embodied Brooksville's stubborn resistance to change, was now becoming its unlikely champion. The next Sunday, Eleanor did something even more unexpected. She attended Marcus's lecture at the library, sitting quietly in the back as he spoke about the importance of preserving history, not just the comfortable parts, but the uncomfortable truths that shaped communities like Brooksville. "History isn't just dates and names," Marcus said to the small crowd. "It's stories, stories of struggle, mistakes, and redemption. It's about the people we remember and the people we forget, and it's our responsibility to ensure that no one's story is erased." Eleanor listened intently, her hands folded in her lap. When the lecture ended, she waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching Marcus. "You spoke well," she said, her voice soft. "Thank you, Mrs. Whittaker," Marcus replied. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then handed him a small folded piece of paper. "I wrote Henry a letter. I'd like to send it to him, if you wouldn't mind looking it over first." Marcus unfolded the paper and scanned its contents. The letter was simple, but heartfelt. Eleanor had written about the memories she carried, the guilt she felt, and her hope that Henry might find peace, knowing that his story mattered to her. "It's beautiful," Marcus said, looking up at her. "I think Henry will appreciate this." Eleanor exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I hope so," she said quietly. "I want him to know that I see him now, truly see him." As winter settled over Brooksville, the town seemed to breathe a little easier. Marcus continued his work at the library, his presence now a respected and welcomed part of the community. Parents who had once watched him warily now greeted him with smiles. Children eagerly attended his workshops, their laughter filling the library's once silent halls. Eleanor, too, became a different presence in town. She still walked with her familiar, rigid posture, but her demeanor had softened. She volunteered at the library occasionally, shelving books alongside Marcus. She even began speaking openly about her past, sharing Henry's story with anyone willing to listen. "It's never too late to change," she would say, "but you have to want to see the truth first." For Marcus, it was a reminder of why he had come to Brooksville in the first place. History wasn't just something to be studied. It was something to be lived, learned from, and shared. And sometimes the smallest actions, like confronting an old truth or offering forgiveness, could spark the greatest changes. On the last day of the year, Marcus received a postcard in the mail. It was from Henry Jennings. "Professor Green, thank you for helping Eleanor find me. Her words gave me something I didn't know I needed. Acknowledgement. I hope she finds peace, as I have. History is a strange thing. It never truly leaves us, but sometimes it gives us a second chance." Henry Jennings. Marcus read the postcard twice, his chest swelling with emotion. He set it carefully on his desk and gazed out the window at the snow-covered streets of Brooksville. The ripples of change had begun, and somewhere, deep down, he knew they would continue long after this story was done. Winter in Brooksville settled like a thick white quilt over the town. Snow clung to rooftops and blanketed the streets in soft silence. The chill in the air was sharp but invigorating, as though the season itself symbolized a fresh start. For Marcus, the weeks following Henry Jennings' postcard felt different, lighter, as if the small town, too, had exhaled a breath it had been holding for decades. Marcus sat at his desk one morning, the postcard from Henry carefully placed alongside Eleanor's handwritten note. He had kept both as reminders, one of forgiveness offered, the other of courage found. The silence of his home was broken by the soft knock of someone at his front door. When he opened it, Eleanor Whitaker stood there, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, her breath visible in the frosty air. "Good morning, Professor Green," she said, her voice carrying a rare warmth. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker," Marcus replied, stepping aside. "Come in. It's freezing." Eleanor hesitated, then shook her head. "I won't stay long. I wanted to give you something." She held out a thin, bound book. Marcus took it, curious, and turned it over in his hands. The cover was plain, but his eyes widened when he opened it and saw what was inside. Pages of handwritten notes, sketches, and memories. "It's my family's history," Eleanor said softly. "The parts we were proud of, and the parts we buried. I started writing it after we visited Henry." Marcus looked up at her, admiration shining in his eyes. "This couldn't have been easy to write." "It wasn't," Eleanor admitted, her voice steady but reflective. "But I realized something after seeing Henry again. Hiding the truth doesn't protect us. It only keeps us from growing. I wanted to make sure my family's story was told honestly, so that future generations can learn from it and be better." Marcus flipped through the book, pausing at one page where Eleanor had written about Henry Jennings. A short sketch of him accompanied her words. Her handwriting trembled slightly, but her sincerity was unmistakable. "You've done something remarkable, Mrs. Whitaker," Marcus said quietly. "This is how change begins, by facing the truth, not hiding from it." Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I wouldn't have done this without you. Without your patience, your belief that people can change." Marcus shook his head. "You did the hard work. You chose to change. I just helped you see what was already there." She looked at him for a moment, and for the first time, Marcus saw her not as the rigid, suspicious woman she had been, but as someone willing to grow, someone humbled by the weight of her mistakes, and now willing to make amends. Eleanor's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the first light of dawn was spilling over the snow-dusted trees. "It's strange," she murmured. "I spent most of my life thinking the world couldn't change. And now, here I am, an old woman trying to make things right. It took me too long to see it, but maybe it's not too late after all." "It's never too late," Marcus said firmly. "Not if you're willing to take the first step." Eleanor nodded, her expression softening. "Well, I'll leave you to it. I'm sure you've got work to do." Marcus smiled and watched her walk back to her house, her steps deliberate but light, as though a burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. At the d'école the following week, Brooksville gathered at the library for a special event, Marcus's final workshop of the year, focused on the untold histories of the community. It was the largest turnout he'd seen since arriving. Parents, children, teachers, and familiar faces filled the room, their chatter hushed with anticipation. At the front of the room, Marcus stood beside a display of historical photographs, documents, and handwritten accounts. Among them was Eleanor Whitaker's book, Reflections of Brooksville, A Family's Story. When Marcus began speaking, the room fell silent. "History isn't a static thing," he said, his voice carrying through the space. "It's living. It's breathing. It's shaped by the choices we make every day. What we choose to remember, and what we choose to forget. But history doesn't belong to one group of people. It belongs to all of us. Every story matters." He paused, letting his words settle. "We cannot change the past, but we can choose to acknowledge it, to learn from it, and to do better. That's how communities grow. That's how people grow." From the back of the room, Eleanor sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap, listening intently. The others around her, neighbors, friends, even those who had once shared her suspicions, listened too, their expressions thoughtful and reflective. When the workshop ended, people lingered to view the displays, talking softly among themselves. Parents pointed out photos to their children, sharing stories they had never thought to tell before. Eleanor's book sat open on a table, and several people flipped through its pages, their faces a mixture of curiosity and awe. As Marcus packed up his materials, Eleanor approached him. "You did good today, Professor Green," she said quietly. Marcus smiled. "So did you, Mrs. Whitaker." She glanced at her book, where others were still reading her words. "It's strange, seeing people read about my family, about Henry, but I think it's the right thing." "It is," Marcus assured her. "Truth has a way of setting things right, even when it's hard to face." Eleanor nodded, her expression one of peace. "Well, I suppose there's still work to do." "There always is," Marcus agreed. In the months that followed, Brooksville continued to change, not dramatically, but steadily. Marcus became a respected and beloved figure in the town, his workshops inspiring others to share their own family histories. Eleanor Whitaker's story sparked quiet conversations about the past, about prejudice, forgiveness, and the power of truth. Eleanor, for her part, remained steadfast in her mission to make amends. She volunteered at the library regularly, working beside Marcus and Clara. She even began tutoring young children in reading, her once hardened demeanor softened by the realization that it was never too late to make a difference. And though the road wasn't perfect, the town began to reflect the change its people were striving for, one small step at a time. On the first day of spring, Marcus sat at his desk working on his manuscript. He had decided to dedicate his book to the people of Brooksville, to those who had shown that even the most unlikely hearts could change. As he wrote, he glanced at the window and saw Eleanor Whitaker walking down the street, her posture still upright, but her steps relaxed. She waved briefly to a neighbor, a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Marcus smiled to himself, the words flowing easily onto the page. "History belongs to all of us, It is our responsibility to honor the truth, no matter how painful it may be, because when we acknowledge the past, we give ourselves the power to shape a better future. And it all begins with the smallest act of courage, a willingness to see, to speak, and to change. As the sunlight spilled across his desk, Marcus knew this was not the end of the story. It was simply a new beginning, for Brooksville, for Eleanor, and for anyone brave enough to face the truth and embrace change.